It's fast becoming clear that by recent Russian standards, the withdrawal from Kherson was fairly well organized and not nearly as bad as was originally thought. Material was lost, but given that there was sufficient time allocated to the process by General Surovikin, the retreat could be deemed a success in the eyes of a rather tired and battered Russian army. With this questionable Russian effort fresh in our minds, we thought, let's take a look at what we would consider our top 5 successful military retreats. Number 5. The Nez Perce. In 1877, the United States government seized the ancestral lands of the Nez Perce Native Americans. They were ordered to a reservation in Idaho. The charismatic chief Joseph reluctantly complied, but after a group of angry warriors killed several white settlers, the tribe found itself at war with the U.S. Army. The result was one of the greatest fighting retreats in military history. The decision was made to find sanctuary in Canada, the Nez Perce chased by their pursuers on a 1,400-mile chase across Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Despite numbering just 700 of which only 200 were warriors, they managed to outmaneuver and defeat some 2,000 U.S. cavalrymen in multiple battles. General Sherman later noted that the Indians fought with almost scientific skill, using advance and rear guards, skirmish lines and field fortifications. Sadly, after 15 weeks on the run, the Nez Perce were cornered after October 1877's Battle of Bear Paw and forcibly moved to a reservation. They had made it to within 40 miles of the Canadian border. "My heart is sick and sad," Chief Joseph said in a famous surrender speech. "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." A truly epic effort whilst seriously outnumbered. Obviously in this case they didn't technically succeed, but what they did do was to put their aggressors to the sword and send them on an incredibly long goose chase. Number 4. The Yanks make a run from New York. Less than 2 months after the July 1776 signing of the Declaration of Independence, General George Washington's Continental Army was in a fight for its life. The Patriots had failed to check a British amphibious attack on Long Island, and following a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Brooklyn, some 9,000 Americans were pinned against the East River. While British General Sir William Howe settled in for a siege, Washington ordered his men to round up all the flat-bottomed boats they could find. As drenching rains fell on the night of August 29, he used his hastily assembled flotilla to silently ferry unit after unit across the river to the safety of Manhattan. The regiment of Massachusetts fishermen that manned the boats used rags to muffle the sound of their oars, and campfires were left burning to deceive the British. Many Continentals had still yet to be evacuated from Brooklyn by sunrise, but luckily for Washington, a dense fog rolled in and masked the final stages of the withdrawal. By the time the British finally realized what was happening, all 9,000 colonists had slipped away along with most of their equipment and artillery. In the history of warfare, I do not recollect a more fortunate retreat, Continental officer Benjamin Tallmadge later wrote. If I can ask you to take a minute and subscribe. Also, if you are enjoying this video, please drop a like. We love making content and hope you will join us. Number 3. Getting the hell out of Gallipoli. In April 1915, the Allied forces launched a disastrous invasion of the Ottoman Empire via the Gallipoli Peninsula. Their landings were met with fierce resistance from Gallipoli's Turkish defenders, and most of the Allied troops were unable to advance more than a few hundred yards past their beachheads. The campaign soon became all about trench warfare, and instead of opening a new front, simply recreated the same pain being felt in France. By the time the Allies finally began the evacuation in December 1915, they had suffered over 200,000 casualties. Due to the overall appalling conditions, almost 46,000 were dead. Whilst the attack itself was a total cock-up, the retreat was brilliant. As part of a multi-phase operation, troops were quietly ferried off the beaches right under the Turks' noses. Extra tents and cooking fires were used to give the impression of larger numbers, and empty equipment boxes were left on the beach to convince the enemy that nothing had been removed. Near the end of the evacuation, some soldiers even covered their getaway with so-called drip guns, which were rifles rigged with strings and water weights to make them fire automatically. Despite thoughts that a retreat would cost them half their troops, the Allies escaped Gallipoli with only a handful of casualties. A successful retreat is always the sign of excellent planning and execution, just a pity they were there in the first place. The whole invasion was a mistake, and a costly one at that. Number 2. The Americans leave Chosin. This was where a United Nations detachment made a 78-mile fighting withdrawal along a muddy mountain corridor. The force of U.S. Marines, Army troops and British Royal Marines had been attacked and surrounded in late November 1950 by a much larger Chinese force. Led by the 1st Marine Division, the Allies broke out of the enemy encirclement and began a 2-week fighting retreat to the seaport of Hungnam. Along with enduring Arctic conditions where the temperatures dropped to 34 degrees below zero. They also battled the Chinese at places like Hellfire Valley and Funchalin Pass. The veterans of the frozen Chosin later reached the evacuation point at Hungnam in mid-December. By then, the retreating UN army had suffered 17,000 casualties compared to a staggering 60,000 for the Chinese. This was truly an astounding feat and will unlikely ever be repeated. It was so impressive it almost made it to number 1. Number 1. Small boats pick up an army from the French coastline. The evacuation of Dunkirk began on May 27, 1940, when the first of some 338,000 British, French and Belgian troops were evacuated from the French coast. The Allies had retreated to the sea a few days earlier after failing to block Germany's blitzkrieg invasion of France and the Low Countries. Cornered and in deep trouble, Adolf Hitler unwisely halted his panzer tanks' advance. This gave the British Expeditionary Force time to fortify the port of Dunkirk and initiate a retreat codenamed Operation Dynamo. The British Admiralty put together a fleet of over 900 Navy ships, merchant vessels, ferries, and paddle steamers and began transporting soldiers to the English mainland under heavy fire. Scores of civilians also chipped in by piloting fishing boats and pleasure craft across the heavily mined English Channel. The British initially feared it would only be possible to retrieve 45,000 men over the course of 48 hours, but the ragtag armada eventually spent 9 days executing the largest sea evacuation in history. Allied losses were still heavy with many ships sunk, and some 30,000 men left behind, but those that escaped later played a crucial role in the continued fight against Nazi Germany. If you consider it, you could track the winning of World War II back to this retreat. Now the Russian retreat from Kherson is complete, but let's face it, there was not nearly as much success as the ones listed above. Thank you for watching, until next time.